Hey there, everyone. Welcome back to the Para Connection podcast. You're here with Schuler, Nate, and Andy. We have a guest speaker on tonight, and tonight's topic is going to be about mental hospitals, which for me personally, that's a pretty big one. I love it. And what about you, Andy? How do you feel about tonight's topic?
I'm actually feeling pretty good about it. Feeling very good about it, actually. I've got a lot of good things to bring up.
Nice. Yeah, you were telling me a little bit earlier that you have a really good story you want to share regarding mental asylums.
Absolutely.
Awesome. What about you, Nate? How are you feeling about tonight's topic?
Well, I don't really know a lot about mental hospitals or mental institutions. I only hear about I've only heard about a lot of negative things that have happened in the past, and like treatment and, how that played a role in the paranormal with spirits that, were either tortured or, whatever happened to them. It's, I've always seen and heard of a mental hospital as a negative thing because they're not around anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't hear about them.
No, you don't. Not in modern society, you really don't.
Yeah.
Now, on the paranormal side, Andy, I do believe you're kind of confirming with me, you haven't had too much experience with it. Now, for people that's been following me, I have a lot of experience. But just to confirm, Andy, you don't have too much when it regards to paranormal activity or experience, right?
Not in terms of mental hospitals, no.
Okay.
My area was always like personal residences and businesses, but nothing too big like a mental hospital.
Okay. Well, that's fine. Yeah, I'm just kind of wanting to get a little background check for this topic with everyone here tonight. Nate, what about you? Have you been to Waverly Hill?
Yes.
All right.
But that wasn't a mental hospital.
Yeah, but it's the closest thing to tonight's topic that you've been to, right? When it regards to like paranormal investigating.
I mean, yeah.
It's the closest thing.
I've only been to a place that was considered a state hospital, but they really weren't a state hospital. It was a private hospital.
Yeah.
The only other thing I've really done research on in the past and have been interested in is in Staten Island in New York. There used to be a mental hospital on the island where, state budget cuts caused a lot of short staff.
Yeah.
Where there'd be like one nurse to like 80 people, and the conditions were really horrible, and eventually it closed. But there's a lot of like backstory to things that possibly are paranormal there. There was like a patient that had, when they closed the hospital, had left, but they blamed him for like various murders of kids that went missing in Staten Island.
Kind of spotty though with their documentation, huh?
Well, no, there's like an actual documentary about.
Oh, okay. That's cool.
I don't know where you can watch it now, but I have watched it a few times just because I thought it was very interesting.
Yeah.
Is that the same hospital that Geraldo did a story on?
Yes.
Oh, wow.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, the documentary is called Cropsy.
Gotcha. Okay, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
You have to bring that up with our guest.
It's interesting.
Whenever we get her on.
It is a very interesting story. I know a lot about that, actually.
Yeah.
Well, we'll have to bring that up when we get our guest on. Speaking of, let's go ahead and talk about her a little bit. Our guest tonight, her name is Sylvia Schultz, and I'm pretty excited to have her on. She's been on several podcasts, and she has her own. We'll let her kind of plug and play all those outlets. But she is a very well-known paranormal author. She has quite a few books out right now, and she just had one come out this month of 2019, and it's called Fractured Souls, and I'm excited to talk about that with her along with mental hospitals because she's kind of talked to me one-on-one before the podcast.
Ooh, I hope it's available on Kindle. I'd love to read it.
It might be. I know she's connected on Amazon, Andy, so she might be able to hook you up with a digital copy.
Cool.
But she's very passionate about mental hospitals and obviously the paranormal, and I'm pretty excited to kind of get a little bit more in depth with her on that because it's a very big topic for me as well as a paranormal investigator and a person. But she's also a librarian, which is a very interesting fact about her. I learned about her from one of my favorite podcasts, Ron's Amazing Stories. And as Ron says, she's a librarian by day, paranormal investigator by night. So shout out to Ron and shout out to Sylvia Shults.
It is on Kindle.
It is on Kindle.
Yep, $4.99.
$4.99.
Yep.
There you go, Andy.
Sweet.
And she has quite a few
Check that
books.
out.
Like, she has a pretty good selection. I was checking up on everything today just to make sure I knew what I was talking about. And man, does she have a collection. It is awesome.
Very cool.
So for anyone out there that hasn't heard about Sylvia Schultz, or for those of you that have, you obviously know what we're talking about. So I'm going to have to add her books to my collection as well. I don't have a Kindle like you, Andy, but I'm more of a, paperback, hard copy type of guy anyway. All right. Well, Andy, Nate, do you guys have anything else regarding what we're covering here?
No?
Not really? All
Not
right.
at the moment.
Well, everyone that's listening, without further ado, let's go ahead and bring on our guest, Sylvia Schultz, and take the podcast from there. All right. I think we have everybody here in the call. Sylvia, Andy, Nate.
Hi.
We're all here.
Awesome. Here we go. All right. So, Sylvia, thank you for joining us tonight. We kind of had you introduced a little bit in the beginning of our podcast, but I think it's the best way to be done is by you introducing yourself and giving a little information of yourself out there.
Okay. Well, my name is Sylvia Schultz, and I sit in dark, spooky places that you don't have to.
I love it.
I've been a paranormal investigator for several years. I consider myself more of a paranormal reporter. I like the sciencey part of it, and I like taking pictures and getting recordings and playing with all the fun toys, but my focus is on the stories and on the experiences. And I collect experiences that other people have had too, and that's what I put in my books and on my podcast called Lights Out. That's what I really enjoy, is people telling me their ghost stories. That's what it's all about, is sharing our experiences and learning from every story.
Awesome, Sylvia. So yeah, you like more of the truth and factual parts of everything. I mean, granted, the lore is fun and the chase is fun, but you like getting people's personal opinions and stories and kind of jumping into that, right?
Oh yes. I really enjoy the history part of the stories. I really firmly believe that you can't understand the ghost stories of a location without knowing the history of the location, because that's why we have the stories, is because people had these experiences there back in the day, and it's their experiences that echo into the present time.
Absolutely. Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you on that. In a way, it's kind of like a time capsule that's more interactive and alive.
It is, yeah. Yeah, I love that. That's the fun of seeking all that information out.
Yeah, it is it's intriguing, and it's also exciting at the same time to go to all these different locations, whether it's state to state, town to town, and go there, know that there was at one point real history, real people walked there, real people lived there, but to have something possible as a spirit or even a non-human entity that's said to walk around and experience that, I think that's just something else. Because the whole waking up in the morning, going to work, coming home, that kind of gets boring for me. So it's nice to step out of that zone.
I agree. We need a little bit of excitement and touching the unknown in our lives.
It is. Yeah, absolutely. So Sylvia, for me personally, I learned about you for the first time by listening to Ron's Amazing Stories, that awesome, amazing podcast.
Oh, that is an amazing podcast. I really enjoy Ron's stories, and I love listening to his voice.
Oh yeah.
And he always has the most interesting things on. I've listened to his podcast several times, and I always come away with my eyes bugging out going, wow, that was really, really cool.
Ron does have a really good trait of collecting unique stories, I do have to say. He's a really cool guy.
Yeah.
And like you said, his voice is everything. That's really what captured me when I heard him for the first time. I'm like, I can listen to this guy for 11 hours of my workday shift. I can get through work now.
Yeah.
I told Ron that too, and he kind of chuckled at me, probably thinking I was weird, but I had to be honest. Thank you, Ron. Shout out to Ron. But listening to you from Ron's amazing stories, Sylvia, you tend to talk about some of these books that you have coming out, and I would like for you to elaborate a little bit on them up to your newest book that you just had come out, if you don't mind.
I would be delighted to.
Awesome.
Okay, so I write books of true ghost stories. The most recent book is called Fractured Souls. It's another collection of true ghost stories and people's experiences and history of the Peoria State Hospital in Bartonville, Illinois. The first book in the series was Fractured Spirits, Hauntings at the Peoria State Hospital. And I very quickly discovered that the stories didn't stop after I typed the end on that book. Wow. People kept having experiences and they kept sharing stories with me, and I myself kept having experiences because it's very close to my home and I visit there as often as I can, and I kept having my own experiences. So pretty soon I had enough for another book. And the thing about the Peoria State Hospital is that we keep learning about it. It closed in 1973, but we're still learning about it. We're still finding newspaper articles. We're still finding records from the old place. And we are still learning stories about the people who lived there and the people who died there. Just to give you an example. Okay, so in the early 1960s, there was a patient there named James Sample. And his mania was that he was God. It was a delusion of divinity. He would go around. He grew up in Minonk, Illinois, which is about an hour and a half away from here. And he was very strange when he was growing up. The story that from his youth is that he was up on a grain elevator painting with a friend of his, and they were taking a break, and they were on this kind of balcony on a grain elevator, and they were looking out over the countryside, and James turned to this friend of his and said, I could push you off this grain elevator and nobody would ever know what happened.
Wow.
Oh.
So super creepy.
Yeah, I would say.
So, yeah. And he was odd enough around town that, word got around, and eventually he did something or other to land him at the asylum in Bartonville. And he continued this delusion of paranormal divinity, and he would carry around the staff of God. He thought he was God, and he would carry around the staff. Now, I was always told that it was a kind of a pry bar. Milk used to come in cans, sealed metal cans, and you would use a pry bar to lift the lid off the can, kind of like getting the lid off a paint can.
Gotcha. Yeah.
But you would do this with the milk. And that's what he would carry around. But I found out doing the research for Fractured Souls that he would carry around pretty much anything. He really honestly was kind of unhinged. I mean, it could be this pry bar, it could be a crowbar, it could be a stick that he found out on the ground. And most of the attendants knew about this mania of his, and they would work with it. And if he was carrying around a stick, they would be like, all right, James, it's time to leave the stick outside now. It's time to go inside to bed. You can leave the stick outside. And they were very gentle with him. But James was working in one of the wards. It was a D ward. And this building was a hospital. It was not one of the cottages, but it was a hospital where people with chronic conditions were. Not enough to land them actually in the hospital, one of the named hospitals on the hilltop, but somewhere where they could recuperate.
Okay.
And in the middle of this building, it's an E-shaped building, and in the middle of it was the dining hall and the kitchen. So James was working in the kitchen. All these patients, if they were able to, had a job to do. He was working in the kitchen, and there was a dietitian working there too. And it was like her second day on the job, and she had no idea how to relate to these patients. She was very brusque in her manner. And she watched James working with that day's staff of God tucked under his arm. And this time it happened to be the pry bar for the milk can. And she watched him work very ineffectually. He was only using one hand because the other was holding the staff of God, kind of tucked up under his arm. And she eventually got really irritated with him and marched over to him and took the pry bar away from him and slammed it down on the counter and said, "Use both hands." Well, this was the staff of God. You do not touch the staff of God without the angel of God's permission. So he took up the staff and he smote her with it.
Oh my God.
He split her skull. And again, I was always told that she was dead before she hit the floor. But it turns out, with further research, this dietitian made it all the way from the kitchen into the dining hall, screaming bloody murder with the head wound that was just gushing. And James Sample followed her from the kitchen out into the dining hall and hit her again, and that one killed her. And so yeah, the stories get refined as the years go on, as more research gets done. So I found that very, very interesting. And D Ward is still haunted by the ghost of the dietitian. And interestingly enough, the people that have encountered her, she doesn't think she did anything wrong. She figures that she was perfectly within her rights to tell James to put that bar down and use both hands. She can't figure out why she got killed.
Wow. That's stubborn.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, regardless if it was right or wrong, I mean, I don't think someone should be killed over, something like that.
Right, yeah.
But, wow.
And James used up all his chances after that. He got sent to a secure facility after that, which, that meant going to prison after that. He was not allowed in the population of the asylum anymore.
Wow. That is something else, Sylvia.
Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like that location alone, I know you've been around several places, but that one alone, it has a lot of characteristics of people in bloodstains that stand out. And like you said,
yes.
And like you said, over the years, these stories get refined over time with, facts and different types of evidence that's brought out to the light. It's kind of like what, I think it's what Ryan was talking to our team about last time we on our last podcast, or it may have been our last meeting. He said when it comes to a paranormal story or a quote unquote haunting, if there's not exact documents or some type of database where what happened, it's kind of like the telephone game. You have a group of people that start with the original story. 10 years go on, it kind of changes. 20, 30 goes on. It's a completely different story by that time.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I've had that happen at the Peoria State Hospital too.
Really?
Okay. So, yes.
Go ahead.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
All right. So there were 63 buildings on the hilltop at the asylum's height.
Wow.
12 of those buildings are left. We lost the Bowen building a couple summers ago. That was the administration building. It was the nurses' college and dormitory. It was the finest nurses' college in the country for 36 years.
Impressive.
It was an amazing place. It was this beautiful stone building, really, really gorgeous. And it fell into the hands of people who just wanted to make money off of it.
Gotcha.
So she died a very long, protracted, painful death with lots of legal wrangling, and it was just an ugly situation. But when it was still standing, the Bowen building, as I said, it was used as the nurses' college and nurses' dormitory for a very long time. And then in the mid-1960s, there was a big remodel at the asylum, and it became the administration building. So on a tour of the Bowen building, you would go onto the second floor, and there was a room, a corner room on the second floor that was kind of divided down the middle, great big beautiful windows on all sides of this room, and divided down the middle by a wall with a door with chicken wire window in it, and two big windows on either side, if I remember correctly, that also had chicken wire in them. And the tour guides that were doing the tours of the Bowen at that time would tell you with a completely straight face that that room was the room where they did the lobotomies.
Oh, wow.
And they would do the lobotomies, and when the patients started bleeding out, the doctors and nurses would run behind the door and lock the door and watch the patients bleed out through these big windows.
Really?
Well, let's unpack this, shall we? Here's where the game of telephone comes in. Okay, number one, there were very few lobotomies performed on the hilltop. All of the lobotomies that were performed were done after 1938, after Dr. Zeller passed away. And I'll be talking about Dr. Zeller soon. So the lobotomies that were done on the hilltop were done in extremis. This was the last resort of treatment for a patient who would not have been helped any other way. In a lobotomy, in the Trans-Orbital Lobotomy, you basically nudge the eyeball aside with a sharp instrument. It's also called an ice pick lobotomy for that very reason. And the instrument is introduced into the brain, and you go up and then down, and then you pull it out. There's no blood. At the very worst, the patient would have a black eye. But there is no blood involved in a lobotomy.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah. And all right, we're talking about the game of telephone. If you look out the windows of that room, you can see where the Leviton and the Talcott hospitals used to stand before they were torn down. And it was in those hospitals that the lobotomies were performed, not in the Bowen building. The Bowen building was nurses' classrooms. And the reason when they did the remodel, that room was turned into a storage room for patient records and prescription pads. That was the reason for the locked doors, was to keep the prescription pads and the patient records secure. That's all it was. Yeah.
Not as extreme as it was thought out to be.
Not nearly. Wow. But Christina Morris, who has been studying the hospital for decades, was a tour guide there, and she put together a bunch of talking points. She's very interested in the history of the place, and she put together index cards with talking points for the tours, for the other tour guides to use. And over time, those cards all got lost. So looking out the window to the other hospitals became, to see where the lobotomies were performed, where the lobotomies were performed in that room. And how do you explain the locking door? Oh, the doctors and nurses went behind the door to lock. No, it was the patient's records behind there. Nothing nearly so dramatic.
Wow.
So yeah, the game of telephone is a real thing. It's a very real thing.
That's really interesting. And Sylvia, it's funny and kind of sad how easy it is for people to be able to either elaborate a story or just not know it, and they make up their own instead of trying to do research or reach out to someone that knows their stuff. Be like, hey, this is what I think. Am I right? They just kind of throw it out there. Oh, this
right. they never asked. They never asked. There were people that were able to tell them, and they just never asked. So,
Andy, do you want to get on here a little bit? You have any questions so far for Sylvia?
Well, there was something I wanted to bring up.
Sure, what's up?
In terms of mental hospitals being haunted and things like that, I can completely understand why they would be. Because when I've always had an interest in the paranormal since I was very, very young. And so I've been reading up on the subject for years and years. And one of my main interests has always been mental hospitals. And I came across an article once when I was in school, and I decided to do a report on it. And that report was, I'm sure you're familiar with it, but it was on the ugly laws.
The ugly laws?
Yes, where they would take people with disabilities and lock them away. Because for a long time, people with disabilities were not allowed to be seen in public. And this was by law. And so
I think I've read about that,
Yeah, so a lot of them would be locked away in mental institutions. And for those people who couldn't afford that, they would be locked away in their homes. And they would not be allowed out of certain rooms of their homes. And I always found that interesting because I'm disabled myself, so this really resonated with me. But I believe this went on from the mid to late 1700s, clear on through to the mid 1970s.
Whoa!
And interestingly enough, since you're from Illinois, I believe Illinois was actually the first state to abolish these laws.
Oh, that's good to know.
According to my research. So yeah. But I mean, they went through terrible, terrible things, and they didn't deserve it because they weren't crazy. They were just different. You know? And I believe also the gay community kind of fell into this as well. They would lock, the people from the gay community away and things like that. And it was differences that scared society that they didn't understand. They would take those people and they would lock them away. And they would go through horrific things. I mean, like such as the lobotomies that you just mentioned. They would go through like different types of water type therapies, hydrotherapy, I believe it's called, electroshock therapy, and things like that. But they didn't need it. These were those therapies can help, but only if you're suffering from mental illness. If you're not, it's torture. Right. And the thing was, though, is because they didn't understand very well these things at that time, they assumed that these disabilities or being gay was a mental thing. They thought it was all in their head. So they thought that it could be corrected through these so-called therapies. Yeah. And it didn't solve anything, but it put a lot of people through a lot of torture and torment and turmoil. And to me, because of that, there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that a mental hospital could very well be haunted, because I mean that's a lot of turmoil in one place. This is definitely true. Yes. Yeah. And I stand by that
that analysis of it 100%. And I'm sure, I know that that's why a lot of mental hospitals are haunted. And I mean, you say haunted mental asylum, and your mind automatically goes all American Horror Story on you. And you assume, just like you were talking, Andy, about pain and fear and abuse. But it is my joy and my privilege to tell people that that was not the case at the Peoria State Hospital. This was a place of caring and compassion. This was a place where the patients were treated like family. This was a place that had movies every Friday night and dances every Saturday night. This was a place where the patients' cottages were decorated for each patient's birthday and all the holidays.
Well, that's very cool. That is very good to know.
Yes.
Very happy to hear that.
This is a place where every Sunday afternoon during the summer and fall, when the good weather was going on, they would have a baseball game after church. Yeah.
That's very cool.
Yeah.
Well, good. It's glad.
That's why I love the place so much.
I'm glad to know that not every facility was like that, you know?
Yeah.
Because according to my research, there were many, many, many of them that were. And
yeah, unfortunately, that's true. Yeah.
Yeah. But I did a report on it when I was in school. I've always remembered that research that I did, because it really resonated with me as a disabled person myself. I was born with spina bifida, so I'm in a wheelchair. And so yeah, it really resonated with me and hit home. So I had to do a report on it when I was in school, and it just really it really struck a chord with me and struck up a lot of emotion. So but I'm really happy to hear that, you know, not every facility did that sort of thing. That's, to me, that's a relief, you know.
Yes, I'm so grateful to have a place like the Peoria State Hospital so very close to me and so accessible.
Yeah, absolutely.
About it, I love studying the history, and I love studying the people that were there. They're like friends to me now.
Right.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it always just kind of struck a chord with me, because a lot of these people, like, they would go through things like not even being fed or looked after by their own families.
Yeah,
you know?
Yeah.
And,
Research like that is going to stick with you.
Yeah, and I was lucky enough to have been born just a few years after those laws were abolished. I believe those laws were abolished around roughly 1974, 75-ish, and I was born in 79, so cutting it close there. But but yeah, I mean, it's, you know, it's just something that really stuck with me, that, you know, those people had to go through that, because that's just terrible.
Yeah. Well, fortunately, we also had places like the Peoria State Hospital.
Right.
Not very many, but the Peoria State Hospital is really one of a kind, I think. I've not encountered very many places that had the reputation that the Peoria State Hospital did. There was a psychiatric facility in St. Joseph, Missouri that came close, but the Peoria State Hospital, that's Bartonville. That's my home.
Right.
Yeah.
So Sylvia, with that being said, regarding the history and, you know, the alleged paranormal activity that does go on there, why do you believe that the attached spirits that are there at that location, why are they still there if there was more positive energy than negative?
Oh, that's because that's where they felt safe. They had a home there. They were welcomed. They were welcomed with open arms. That was it may have been the one place in their life where they felt safe and cared for. Why wouldn't they want to stay? Absolutely.
Yeah.
I heard a lovely story. This happened several years ago. The historian was doing a cemetery tour, and there was a member of the audience that was recording, of course, and someone asked that very same question. Well, if this was such a place of safety and comfort and everything, and it wasn't a bad place, why is it so haunted? And the historian started talking about the good care that the patients got here. And even before she started talking, there's a young girl's voice that comes through on the recorder, and it says, "They're just so nice here."
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. Well, I can understand that. It's more of a positive track to them to where they wouldn't want to leave. So for one, it's a routine. They have their habits and they're used to the environment. Even though they may have people coming in that look a little different and there's obviously some change, if they're intelligent, they still have that comfort feeling of that being home because they're obviously attached from being familiar.
Oh, yes. And most of the spirits at the asylum are definitely intelligent spirits.
Are they?
Oh, yes. Some of them may not know they're dead, but they are definitely intelligent spirits, and they will interact with you in some of the most delightful ways. We have a lot of very, very special, wonderful personalities at the asylum. I'm trying to think of which story to tell you first. Well, there is an entire chapter in Fractured Souls about a spirit that I know in the basement of the Pollock Hospital, which is the tuberculosis ward. His name is Christopher. He says that the last year he remembers is 1905.
Wow.
Yeah, and actually he came from a farm somewhere in Indiana.
Really?
That's what he tells us, yes. And I made his acquaintance several years ago, but I didn't really get to talk to him until I went down there with a friend of mine named Diane Lockhart, and she is a psychic medium, and she was able to kind of translate, and we actually got to have a conversation together. Just some of the highlights. Chris told us that, well, he prefers Chris rather than Christopher. He told us something that just broke my heart. I told you about the dances every Saturday night. He said that he could hear the music coming from the other cottages, but he couldn't go and join the dances because he was in quarantine because he had tuberculosis.
Oh, wow.
And that just broke my heart. And he died when he was 22.
Wow.
We got an EVP. We got an EVP of a voice saying he was 22. And it confirmed because Diane was talking, and she said, Diane said he was very young, only about 22. And right after that, we got an EVP that said he was 22.
That's fascinating, Sylvia. Something intelligent like that. I mean, come on. That's something else.
Yeah. And actually, I'll put in a little bit of information here in Fractured Spirits and in Fractured Souls. If you're reading through it and you see a little ghosty icon in the margin of that page, that's your signal that there's extra stuff on the internet. So you can actually find that recording on my website, on sylviaschultz.wordpress.com, and you can listen to these EVPs as you're reading the book. And that little ghosty icon is your signal that, hey, there's an EVP you can listen to, or a video you can watch.
I'm actually going to look into that after the podcast.
It's super, super fun stuff. But anyway, yeah, Christopher told me that he didn't get to go to these dances. So the next time I came down there, I recorded some ragtime music on my phone. And I didn't try to explain that to him or anything. I was just like, hey, Chris, I brought you a present. And played the song for him, played this ragtime song because it's 1905. And Diane's looking at him. She can actually see him. And she's like, he's doing something with his hands on his knees. What? And I said, oh my God, he's doing the Charleston.
That is great.
Yeah. So this song ended, and he said, no one's ever done that for me before.
Wow.
So yeah, it was just he's precious. Chris is my guy.
You had a connection.
So yeah.
Sure.
That is super.
Yeah,
good.
we really do have a connection. I'm told that that I remind him of his sister.
Really?
One of the mediums that was down there said he loves you, but not in a romantic way. He said she said you remind him of a family member, and then Diane was able to talk to him further, and she's like, yeah, you remind him of his sister. So that's neat. Yeah. And during my first conversation with him via Diane, at the very end of the conversation, he said, when you get to heaven, I'll be waiting for you. Just look for the tall, skinny guy with the dark hair.
Really?
Yeah.
And I'm not getting vibes about that being bad. That's just kind of like a cool connection that he feels that close.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I've never sensed anything bad anywhere in any of the buildings in the Peoria State Hospital on that entire hilltop. There are some spirits that are a little rough around the edges.
Yeah.
But nothing bad. Nothing ever bad. I have a humorous story to share with you about one of our intelligent spirits, if you're up for that.
Sylvia, please go right ahead.
Okay. Now, this happened to a friend of mine, David Youngquist. Several years ago, he and I had a publishing company, and he wanted to come down to my area of the state and do some library visits and kind of push the publishing company. And he lived in Princeton, about an hour and a half north of me. So he came down to East Peoria, visited my library, and then I sent him on this little mini tour of the libraries in the area. And I sent him to the library in Bartonville. Now, David is a sweetheart, and I love him like a brother, but he is directionally challenged. So I gave him detailed directions on how to get from East Peoria to Pekin, and Pekin to Bartonville, and Bartonville back to East Peoria, because he was going to have lunch with me. So I said, all right, so you're going to drive up this hill, and this road goes right through the middle of the asylum complex. So I said, you're going to go up this hill. When you get to the top of the hill, there's going to be a big stone building on your right, because the Bowen hadn't been torn down yet. I said, put your guards up. I'm not kidding about this, because he is sensitive. And I knew that would give him problems if I didn't warn him. So I get this text from him halfway through the morning, and he goes, was there a tuberculosis ward at this asylum that you've been writing your book about? And I go, yeah, it was called the Pollock Hospital. And he goes, that's what I thought. I picked up a hitchhiker. I'm like, oh, I have to hear about this. So he meets me for lunch, and over lunch he tells me the whole story. So he's driving up Pfeiffer Road, driving up the hill, and when you're driving up the hill, you're actually driving through what used to be the basement of one of the hospitals. So you're really in the middle of this asylum territory. So he's driving up the hill, and he becomes aware that there's someone sitting in the passenger seat of his truck. And he kind of tunes in on this spirit. And David's a nice, polite guy, and he goes, hello, my name's David. What's your name? And the spirit goes, I'm George. And David said, well, what's wrong, George? George says, well, I have TB. And David said he could see George, and you could tell that he was a big guy, and he'd been like a farmer or something. He wore overalls and worked with his hands, but he was very gaunt, and like he had gotten sick later in life. And he's like, oh, okay. And David goes, you're not planning on coming home with me or anything, are you? And George says, no, this is my home. And David said, okay. So, what are you doing in my truck? And George said, well, I don't get out much.
Wow.
I was howling. I was absolutely howling. I'm like, what? You don't get out much?
I don't even know how I would respond to that. Like,
so he's in the passenger seat, and he's looking at he's turning the radio on and off, and he's messing with stuff, and he's like, how in the world do you drive this truck without a gear shift? So David had to explain an automatic transmission to him. And George said, wow, I'll bet that makes it really easy to get up the hill.
Wow.
And David's like, well, yeah. So he goes to the library, and the library building is built where the Grace Abbott Children's Center used to be. It used to be the playground for the Grace Abbott Children's Center, and the original library was across the street, and that was it was one of the asylum buildings, so that was still on the ground. So George wasn't leaving the asylum or anything. So he goes to the library, and David's doing his library visit, and he's kind of looking around, trying to keep George away from the computers, because you know how paranormal energy can mess with electronics.
oh yeah.
He really didn't want to be responsible for borking the library's computers. So it's like it was like trying to keep track of a toddler or something. So he leaves the library, and David gets back into his truck, and George gets back into the passenger seat with him, and they drive down the hill. And at the bottom of the hill, which is the edge of the asylum property, at the bottom of the hill, George turns to David and said, well, thanks for putting up with me, and vanished.
Oh,
Really?
Really?
Sylvia, you have seriously sensitive things over there. That is something else.
David said that was the most pleasant, well-behaved spirit I have ever come across.
I'm over here with an open jaw just from the experience. Like, I wouldn't even know what to do in his situation.
Well, like I said, David's sensitive, so he's had this. It's not his first rodeo.
Yeah, I would say from his responses, he took it very well. I'm like, wow.
Yeah.
Man. Andy, as a sensitive yourself, what do you feel about that story? How would you react to that situation?
Well, I can honestly say I've never had an experience like that. That is for sure. But I would actually find it quite humorous myself. I probably wouldn't be able to contain the laughter through the whole thing.
That's really neat. I like those stories. That, you know, I mean, they're not scary at all. They're a little odd because, I mean, that's, for me and most people in the world, I'm sure that's not an everyday happening, but
Yeah.
it would be
Right.
experience, you know, to go through something like that and to interact with such an intelligent spirit that's basically still human, and they know what a truck is.
Yeah.
They're playing with things, you know, kind of like people like us. We play with drones when they first came out. They're like, oh, how does this work, you know? And so that's
Mhm. Mhm.
kinda cool to tear that down and look at it. Nate, do you have anything for Sylvia?
So you talked about the hospital being very, very friendly with patients, and
Yeah.
how the interactions with their patients was almost like a family.
Yes.
That kind of brought up a place that I actually got to visit in Traverse City.
Okay.
And it was about 2 years ago. I got to go and visit the Traverse City State Hospital.
Mhm.
Is that in Indiana?
Traverse City, Michigan.
Michigan. Okay.
That location has recently been rehabbed, so most of the buildings are still standing. The main building has been completely renovated back to its original, and they actually turned the building into low income and middle income housing.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so it's interesting because like they allow you to go through the building. The basement of the building has been turned into restaurants and shops and, you know, art gallery. The other buildings, are still standing on the property, but are condemned, or not condemned, but they're sitting there, but they're trying to protect them as much as they can because they have plans on restoring every single building.
Oh, wow.
So the thing about the location that, you know, and the reason why I'm bringing it up is because this location also had a very similar approach to patient therapy. And the family, which was the Munson family, still owns hospitals in that city.
Oh, my.
So the family's been around for so long that the Munson name has always been around. So the building was built in 1882. It was 300,000 square feet. The original main structure is 1/4 of a mile long.
Okay, so it's a big Kirkbride building.
Yes.
It
was very interesting because it was state of the art, and this was like a very detailed constructed building, and they had a state-of-the-art ventilation system that was designed for the hospital, which like included large fans that would force air through the underground tunnels into the basement, up through the flues in the various parts of the building, where it would almost act like a ventilator.
Sure.
And so the interesting part about it was the doctor that ran the building kind of looked at it as his philosophy as beauty is therapy.
Okay.
So if patients were surrounded by like a beautiful environment, from the architecture to the campus grounds, their emotional and mental state would be uplifted. And
yeah, absolutely.
So their meals at the hospital were served in dining rooms on fine china, glazed with the state seal atop white linen cloths. Fresh flowers, plants decorated dining tables and resting areas. And they had their very own cow, which produced milk for the entire facility.
Wow. Poor cow.
Well, it was just so weird because there's this random statue of a cow that you're just, what is this? And it just happened that, you know, this cow, you know, actually played a big, you know, role in, you know, the stability of that facility.
That's fabulous.
I actually know exactly what you're talking about, Nate. It's called the Village at Grand Traverse Commons.
Yes.
Okay.
That's what it's called.
So that was a private asylum. Because that during the middle of the 19th century and the early 20th century, they had private asylums that were, I mean, the architect Frederick Law Olmsted helped design some of these asylum grounds, and that was the theory behind the Kirkbride building. Is every window looked out on these beautifully landscaped and manicured grounds, and they had the highest quality of care. And then you had state hospitals, which were
this actually was a
right. Was it a state hospital? Really?
Yeah.
Wow. That is unusual.
Yeah, it was the Traverse City State Hospital.
Okay. Yeah, so it wasn't a private asylum. It was neat.
Yeah.
Well, that's good. That gives me hope.
So they actually had their own power plant. There was a large tunnel that went from one end of the facility to the to another part of the grounds. And they actually allow you to go down there, and it's very well kept. Like, you think of like a tunnel being like, oh my gosh, that's gross. It's probably really creepy. Very well lit.
Spiders.
But we were able to, you know, go on this kind of mini tour of the buildings. Some of the buildings we couldn't go into because of asbestos, and you know, even kind of going up close to them and having like the air come blowing out of them. was kind of a little unnerving because I'm just thinking to myself, okay, I probably shouldn't be standing up really close to the building. But I also was just really curious because it was like, you could walk around the property and they didn't tell you, no, you couldn't be there.
Oh, wow.
But it was just the grounds were so interesting because every single building had a really big, wide open, covered porch on each floor.
Ooh.
So patients
oh
can go
my
outside and like enjoy, being outside. They were all fenced in because of, preventing jumping and all of that. But
okay.
there was a lot of like, they looked at it like, they would have like, outdoor exercises and very, very therapeutic, routines with the patients. And I just thought it was very interesting because like we talked about before, we called you, I've always known a mental hospital as like a negative thing because in my time, I was born in 1987 and there weren't many hospitals open still at that point.
That's correct. Yeah, a lot of them had closed by then.
So now that I've gotten older, I've had a lot more experience with like understanding like what had happened, and it kind of even it affects us these days because we have a lot of people who we look at it like we need mental asylums now. We need to have mental facilities, and as some
yes, we do.
My age, it's like this generation, it's just it's so weird because like we all my parents were in that time period where there still were these mental hospitals, and it always was like they experienced what happened as they closed. They saw homelessness rise, ill patients out on the streets. It's like
exactly right.
Now we're dealing with it. We deal with it at the library on a continuous basis, and
oh yes,
I've always known it as just to be a negative thing. But then like after I had that experience being in Traverse City and like actually going to the grounds and learning about the history of the hospital, that there was actually someone who ran the hospital, doing something good and actually wanting to help people.
Yeah.
It just made my whole outlook a little bit different because I just had not had that experience to actually physically be somewhere where there was a hospital and the buildings were still so.
Yeah. That's what's so neat about going to the Peoria State Hospital. I mean, you can still feel Dr. Zeller's influence on this place. So yeah, I promised I would talk about Dr. George Zeller. I mentioned him earlier in the podcast, and it's time to introduce him to your audience. Dr. George Zeller was the first superintendent of the asylum. He was not trained as a psychiatrist. He was trained as a surgeon, and he had a practice in Peoria. His father did too. He followed in his father's footsteps. And Dr. Zeller was very proud of the fact that he had no psychiatric training. He was very proud of the fact that he was not hidebound by the current theories on how to treat the mentally ill.
Yeah.
He said, let's treat them with kindness and see what happens. And what happened was that the Peoria State Hospital became the premier institution for the care of the mentally ill in the United States, in the world, actually. He insisted that the windows in the cottages be left open a couple inches so that the patients could see that they were not locked in. He insisted that all the doors not be locked. There were only 2 locked wards on the entire hilltop, and that was for the violent wards, for the men and for the women. Other than that, he said, these people don't lock their doors at home. This is the beginning of the 20th century. This opened in 1902. He goes, people don't lock their doors at home. Why would we lock them in when they've come to us for help?
Yes.
Yeah. So that was his attitude, is he insisted on these patients being treated like family. Each cottage had a married couple that was in charge of the place. He put women in charge of all the wards because he really firmly believed in the empowerment of women. He believed that the gentle touch of a woman was much preferable to the hard hand of a man.
Yeah.
There were no fences around the asylum. People were allowed to wander wherever they wanted to. Now, this is interesting that if there starts to be bad weather, you can feel a shift in the energy on the hilltop, because the patients were expected to kind of batten down the hatches if a storm was coming. They were expected. Each of the cottages had a little garden and a chicken coop.
Interesting.
Because they believed that looking after the chickens would help the patients learn about life and death. So they were expected to bring in any outdoor furniture and get the chickens under cover. As a matter of fact, there was a female patient that came to the asylum very violent. She had a real problem with anger management and would just throw stuff around. So she was committed to the asylum for a while until she learned to calm down. And she calmed down. She eventually got well enough to return to her family. And Dr. Zeller interviewed her. It was kind of an exit interview thing. And he's like, I'm curious, what was it that changed things for you? And she told him the story about there was a storm coming, and she had to bring in the little chicks from the yard and get them safely into the chicken coop. And he wrote in his memoirs, he said, I mean, this woman who tore clothes and broke furniture and threw dishes around, she was moved to compassion by the plight of these helpless chicks. That's what turned it around for her.
Wow.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Dr. Zeller was amazing. In the 1980s, there was a mental health facility in Peoria that opened up in the 1980s, which is kind of odd. It closed in the early part of the 21st century, and it was called Zeller Zone, and that was a nod to Dr. Zeller's influence. He died in 1938, and his name is still something to conjure with around the Peoria area. He's still very much revered.
Wow.
That's very cool.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That is Sylvia. You know, and for him to be such an inspiration like that, and his methods and protocols have obviously had a more positive and successful effect on his patients. You know, it's too bad that not other institutions took that upon their hand, you know, to try to take a more positive and compassionate way instead of just using all these different therapies, quote unquote, like electroshock and waterboarding and lobotomies. And it's just interesting, you know, some people that ran asylums, they actually did it the correct way. And sadly, it didn't take enough heed for the rest of the country to kind of take part of that. But.
Right. There were a lot of places that just did not follow the good example that was set by a very few.
No, ma'am, they didn't.
And Dr. Zeller actually testified in front of Congress in 1905, and I used the scene of that testimony as the beginning scene in my book 44 Years in Darkness, which is about one of the patients at the Peoria State Hospital, a woman named Rhoda Derry. And Dr. Zeller was called to Washington, D.C. to testify in front of the House of Representatives. And his testimony is absolutely fascinating. He talks about putting a woman in charge of every ward, and he talks about women being in complete control and being able to handle the fractious patients. It's a really amusing part where he talks about he believed in complete non-restraint.
Yeah.
He got rid of the bars on the windows. When he came to be the superintendent of the asylum, it was built while he was off in the Philippines fighting or serving rather as a surgeon in the Spanish-American War.
Huh.
So they built the asylum. He had a hand in its design, but they built it while he was out of the country. And then he came back and took over the superintendency position. And so when he came to the asylum, it was fitted out the way an asylum of the early 20th century would have been, which meant there were straitjackets, there were handcuffs, there were foot cuffs, there were Utica cribs, there were bars on the windows. And he came in and said, no, we're not going to have this. He took the bars off the windows. And since it's a state hospital, he had to account for everything he did. He was completely transparent. He invited, there was an open door policy for any reporter who wanted to come in at any time. And he had to account for these changes that he did. And so he went in front of the state legislature, and they were like, all right, you've just taken $6,000 worth of bars off of the windows. What are you going to do with them? So what he did was he made a zoo on the grounds. He filled it with deer, and it was like a petting zoo. There was a black bear that was so tame that the patients cared for it. It was so tame that the patients would lead it around to the cottages, and it would take a bath on command.
That is insane.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is
just
cool.
Delightful. Yeah. So Dr. Zeller was talking about this policy of non-restraint in front of the House of Representatives. He was testifying about it, and there was a guy who had come to us from another asylum that had bitten someone's nose off.
Ouch.
Oh.
And yeah, that was his mania. You got too close, he would snap. And Dr. Zeller said, we talked about the advisability of pulling all this patient's teeth, and we said, no, that's not going to help him. And we refused to put him in a straitjacket all the time. I mean, that's not fair. And so the representative who was kind of grilling him on the stand said, well, what do you do in that sort of situation? And Dr. Zeller said, well, we just keep him away from noses. we just don't get too close. That's all it is. So he's just like, treat people with kindness. Yeah. Rhoda Derry was actually mentioned in that testimony because they started asking about patients who self-abused, who hurt themselves, who clawed their own eyes out. And he had to tell them that, yes, we have a patient at our asylum who was in an almshouse for 44 years. And that's what she did. And we took her in and we took care of her. Do I have time to tell Rhoda's story?
Yeah, go right ahead, Sylvia. I think the guys are game for it too.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. So, the story of Rhoda Derry is one of the great tragedies of mental health care in Illinois, and it's one of the great success stories of the Peoria State Hospital. Rhoda Derry was born in 1834. She grew up in Adams County, Illinois, down south, kind of by Quincy. She was absolutely beautiful. She was the baby of the family. She was the youngest of 9 children. Maybe a little bit spoiled, we don't know. But she was a beautiful, beautiful young girl. When she was 16 years old, she did the most natural thing in the world. She fell in love. She fell in love with the son of a neighboring farm family. name was Charles Phoenix. He was also 16 years old. We don't know how far their courtship went, but we do know that after they had been courting for a couple of years, when they were both 18, Charles asked Rhoda to marry him, and she said yes. Now, there was one person that was very much against this relationship, and that was Nancy Phoenix, Charles's mother. And the reason for this was that the Phoenixes were rather well off. The Derrys were dirt poor. Rhoda was the youngest of 9 children. They never even had land to call their own. But the Phoenixes, Charles Phoenix was the older son of only 4 children. So he stood to inherit his father Frederick's land when Frederick passed on. And Nancy Phoenix was not about to have her baby boy Charles marry one of these dirt poor Derrys. So she confronted Rhoda in the street. And she said, "If you do not release my son from this engagement, I will curse you." Now, talking about witchcraft in front of Rhoda Derry really would have gotten her attention very quickly, because Rhoda's grandmother, Moll Derry, was known as the fortune teller of the Revolution. Moll Derry was married to Valentine, and they grew up in Germany. And Valentine was conscripted by the British Army. He was a Hessian soldier, and he was conscripted by the British Army to fight in the American Revolution.
Wow.
And Moll was not about to be left behind in Germany without Valentine, so she disguised herself as a man and emigrated with him and fought alongside him. They switched sides, and they fought for the colonists in the Revolutionary War. Yeah, Moll Derry was a character. She was a force to be reckoned with. After the war, they settled in Pennsylvania, and Moll became a practitioner of Pennsylvania Dutch hex magic. So she was known for counties around as being able to cast and lift curses. So talking about witchcraft in front of Moll Derry's granddaughter, Rhoda Derry, really would have gotten her attention very quickly.
Wow.
Several weeks after this confrontation between Nancy Phoenix and Rhoda Derry, Rhoda started acting very strangely. She had a break with consensual reality. She came home and started acting very oddly. She swore that invisible witches were swooping down to attack her. She would just cower in the corner of the cabin, shrieking that witches were attacking her.
Huh.
Her mother her mother took to keeping a pistol in her apron pocket, and when Rhoda started having these fits, Rachel would whip this pistol around and start firing it at the empty air. I'm not sure how helpful that would have been,
Yeah.
but at least she was trying. At least she was trying to in her own way to combat this mania that Rhoda was suffering from. Now, the interesting thing is that Nancy heard about this. They lived in 2 small towns, but word travels fast in the countryside. And Nancy heard about the troubles that Rhoda was having, and she went to the cabin and tried to get in to see Rhoda. She tried to tell her, "You're okay. There is no curse. I was kidding. You just stop and snap out of it." And that doesn't work with mental illness anyway. And the Derrys would have nothing to do with her, and I don't blame them a bit. And Rhoda refused to see her. So the Phoenixes moved west, and nothing is ever heard from them again. Charles left with his family, and that was the end of their relationship. Rhoda was committed to the state hospital in Jacksonville for 2 years. She was a very violent patient. She was kept on the violent ward. She was locked in her room every night. And every morning, the staff would find her wandering the grounds. And when they asked her, "Who let you out?" her answer was always the same: "Nancy Phoenix let me out."
What?
Wow.
Yeah. That's one of the real weird parts of Rhoda's story that no one's ever been able to answer. I have my own theory about it, but yeah, that's really random weirdness of one of the really strange parts of Rhoda's story. So the thing about state hospitals at that time was that if you were paying for a private institution, you could stay as long as you could afford it. But state hospitals, you were allowed to stay for 2 years, and that's it. If you didn't get better in 2 years, you had to give up your bed to someone else who had a chance of being helped. So Rhoda was released from Jacksonville after 2 years as being incurable. She went back to her family. Her family cared for her at home as long as they could, but in 1860, Rachel, her mother, died. Her father could no longer care for her, so he made the decision to have her committed to the Adams County Almshouse. Now, almshouses in the middle of the 19th century had the potential to be really, really horrible places. If you had $25 for a license and an empty barn in your backyard, you could open up your very own almshouse.
Like a poorhouse.
Because they didn't, yeah, like a poorhouse, exactly.
Gotcha.
They didn't think that the mentally ill could feel cold or heat or hunger. They were sometimes kept in barns and treated no better than animals.
Wow.
The Adams County Almshouse, it was a county house, so it had more oversight. It had a board that it had to answer to and everything. And it was one of the nicer places, but they were not equipped. An almshouse is just a place where if you're down on your luck, like a poorhouse, you can go and get 3 hots and a cot. They're not equipped to deal with the mentally ill. And they were absolutely unprepared to deal with somebody with Rhoda's depth of crazy. She developed a condition called pica, which is a compulsion to eat inappropriate objects. So she would crawl around on the floor, and anything she found on the floor, a pin, a penny, a nail, she would put it right into her mouth. At dinner, if you gave her a piece of chicken, she would cram it into her mouth, bones and all. She wouldn't take bites. She would just, eat the entire piece of chicken, which was not good.
No.
So, and she would lunge at passersby and try to pick the buttons off their blouse and put it in her mouth. So for her own protection, the superintendent of the Adams County Almshouse decided to have Rhoda put into something called a Utica crib. I mentioned that before. It is a baby's crib. It's exactly like a baby's crib, except it's low to the floor, and it also has a barred top, which locks. It's basically a cage.
Yeah. I've seen those in horror movies before as like a staple.
Yes, that is the Utica crib.
Wow. Speaking on Rhoda Derry, is it true that she actually gouged out her own eyes and punched out her own teeth?
Yes, I'm afraid it is.
Wow.
She was in this almshouse. She had been abandoned by her family. She thought she was cursed. Her mother was dead. Her fiancé was who knows where. And she started to self-abuse.
Oh, wow.
Sometime during the first 10 years of being in the Utica crib, she decided she no longer wanted to watch the world go by through the bars of a cage, and she clawed her own eyes out.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Sylvia, did they make a movie about her by chance?
They were going to. They shot a couple of teaser rolls.
Yeah.
But due to very strange circumstances, the entire movie never got made. And I do talk about that in 44 Years in Darkness.
Wow.
In the modern part of the book, I explain the entire process of what happened that this movie did not get made. It was called The Mysterious Rhoda Derry. And I talked to the director of it, and he told me all this random weirdness that went on. Yeah, they shot some footage, and it just never got off the ground because they had they had accidents on the set, and they had accidents in their personal lives, and he just decided after a while, no, this is not worth continuing. So yeah, it never did get made, and people associated with the film started having just weirdness in their lives. So they just decided to let it alone. I don't know if it ever will get made now, but the Peoria State Hospital opened in. Oh well, let me go back to Rhoda in her Utica crib. The Utica crib was never designed for use longer than overnight. There were patients that asked to be put into the Utica crib. There was an expose during the 1880s. A reporter went into one of the asylums in Utica, New York, where the crib was developed, and he was trying to get dirt on, the abuse of the Utica crib. And he talked to a patient, and the patient's like, I sleepwalk. If a nurse puts me into the crib at night, I know where I'm going to wake up in the morning, and that's a real comfort to me. But, like I said, the crib was not designed for use longer than overnight, and Rhoda was kept in this crib for weeks and months on end. The crib is usually lined with a hospital mattress. Rhoda's crib was lined with straw, with a strategically cut hole in the bottom, and a rabbit, like a tray, like a rabbit cage, underneath. And the cage would pull out, and any waste that had fallen through would be disposed of.
Wow.
Yeah, she was not let out to move around and walk around. In result of this, her hips atrophied because she did not get up and exercise. Her knees became drawn up to her chest. She was in a fetal position most of her life. And her hips atrophied because of this treatment. And of course, she beat on her face so much that her front teeth fell out. She spent decades in this situation. Now, in 1902, the Peoria State Hospital opened, and Dr. Zeller became the superintendent. In 1904, he decided that he was going to do an experiment. He firmly believed that no patient is incurable. The asylum started out as the Illinois Hospital for the Incurable Insane. He went to the state legislature and said, you have to change the name of this place. He said, do not tell my patients they're incurable. That's what I'm here to do. So how do you prove that? How do you prove that no one is beyond help? Well, you go to the asylums and the poor houses and the almshouses of the state, and you find the most wretched, abused, pathetic cases, and you rescue them. That's exactly what Dr. Zeller did. He went to the Adams County Almshouse in September of 1904, and he found Rhoda there. By that time, she had been moved to a box bed. She was covered with a thin sheet of canvas. That was all she would tolerate. She would not even tolerate clothes. He found her there, and he said, this patient is coming with me. And the superintendent of the almshouse didn't want to let Rhoda go because he thought that the almshouse was going to be blamed for her condition. Yeah, go figure.
Wow.
And Dr. Zeller said, either this patient comes with me or I shut your institution down, effective immediately.
Oh, wow.
So he was not kidding about that. September 26th, 1904. There was a storm that day, and there was a washout on the tracks. So the train between Quincy and Bartonville didn't get in until very late that night. It was about 1:30 in the morning when the nurses and the attendants got the word that the train had finally arrived on the hilltop. There were about 60 patients from Adams County that were being transferred to Bartonville. They were being transported in a boxcar. And the patients were escorted off of the boxcar, and they were standing on the platform of the train station. And a couple of the attendants went into the boxcar to make sure no one had been left behind. And at the corner of the boxcar, they saw this great big wicker laundry basket. And that was not usual. The patients usually only arrived with the clothes on their backs. It was not a thing for them to be sent along with a load of patient clothing, but the attendant said, well, I guess there's an exception to every rule, so I guess this basket comes off too. So they humped the basket off of the boxcar and they set it down on the platform. And as they did, the lid of the basket opened and the clothes parted, and there sat Rhoda, jabbering at people. She was being transported in the basket because her hips had wasted away so much that she could not sit in a wheelchair for any length of time.
Oh, wow.
Oh my goodness.
Ugh.
That night, for the first time in 44 years, Rhoda Derry slept in a bed with clean white sheets.
Wow.
Yeah.
You know, and here
The nurses.
there's a lot of emotion.
Yeah. I get choked up every time I tell this story. But the nurses knew her excruciating history, and they made sure, they decided immediately that she was going to become the daughter of the institution. She could no longer see, of course, but they made sure that she experienced that hilltop in any way that was left to her. They took her to the gardens and they let her sit out on a blanket and feel the sun on her face and smell the flowers whose colors she could no longer see and listen to the birds singing. They took her to dances so she could enjoy the music. Part of her lore is that she liked chewing tobacco. She picked up the habit of chewing tobacco when she was in her teens, and if she knew that you had chewing tobacco in your pocket, she would kind of crab across the floor to you. She could no longer walk, but she could get around using her hands and crawling on her knuckles, and she would kind of hump across the floor to you and tug on your pants leg to ask for some tobacco. And she knew that Dr. Zeller was her savior. I don't know if she recognized his voice or the scent of his cologne. I don't know what it was, but whenever Dr. Zeller walked into a room where Rhoda Derry was, she lit up. She absolutely knew that he was the one who had saved her. She was with us for 2 years. She probably developed tuberculosis in the almshouse, but in the summer of 1906, her case became full-blown. So she was taken from her cottage to Dining Hall A. Tuberculosis was always a scourge on the hilltop, so the hospital quickly became overrun with TB cases, and other buildings were pressed into service, including Dining Hall A, which still stands on the hilltop. That has not been torn down.
Wow.
So she was in there for several months. She passed away October 9th, 1906, the day before she would have turned 72 years old.
Wow. Lived that long.
Yeah. The White Plague.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's something else. You know, it's kind of wild because it's like Miss Derry's story started out as a extreme Romeo and Juliet type of scenario, and then it just kind of blew into this whole new category of story of like witchcraft and then mental illness and then being forgotten. I mean, she just went from A, B, C, D, E, F, and on. It's like, wow.
Yeah. It was a wild, wild ride. I knew she needed her own book. And actually, 44 Years in Darkness is available as an audiobook. And the narrator of it told the publisher, and the publisher told me that the narrator, while she was working on the book, broke down and cried several times.
Oh, wow. So
it was just that powerful. So.
Well, I mean, just you speaking about it for the short amount of time that you did, I'm over here just staring off into space, building my own images together from your words and just trying to imagine what she lived through. It is really fascinating.
Yeah.
What I was getting from your descriptions. It's crazy.
It's a very powerful story.
Definitely.
When it comes to that, when it kind of taking a step back, I guess, it's just kind of fascinating how mental institutions, some very few were helpful, and then some were obviously the complete opposite. And in her case, it took long enough, but she was finally able to reach one that was helpful, you know? And
Yeah.
it's just like, personally for me, my experiences with mental institutions is the infamous one from Indianapolis, Indiana, called Central State Hospital. And in 2016, it started having deconstruction, so there's really not much left of it, but it ran from 1848 to 1994. And to make a it's been around for quite a while. And from the time it closed in 94 to 2016, there were several buildings still standing, at least 9 to 12 that were left. But my whole point with all this is the history behind Central State's mental institution. It was, from what I read from people I've spoke to that used to work there, it used to be really negative. There were satanic rituals, there were a lot of malpractice and a lot of secrets and a lot of bad things that went on. It was never a good place, at least what was documented. And the only thing that I can say good about Central State and the vast majority of other mental institutions, minus the one you're talking about, Sylvia, and also with Nate, is that they had the right idea. They had gardens, they had a powerhouse, they had a carpentry building, a cannery building, they had a ballroom, a cafeteria. I mean, they basically built their own community, and they were rehabilitating their patients in that sense. But the people that they had working there, they were bad people. They were the ones, the nurses, the doctors, the surgeons, the security guards. They were mistreating the patients. But the original idea of it, trying to be their own community to rehabilitate people, that was the right path. And I think that's what we should do.
Exactly. Yes.
We just need the right people running the place.
You have to have the right people. And that's another thing Dr. Zeller insisted upon. He refused to hire what he called bug housers. If he found out that you had worked in an asylum previous to coming to the Peoria State Hospital, he would sack you. He would not hire you in the first place, and if he found out later that you had worked in another asylum, he would fire you immediately and without cause.
Wow.
He insisted on training his people the way he wanted them to be trained, and he refused to hire anyone who had ever worked at any other asylum.
Well, that's a good way of keeping it pure in my mind. Making sure that the treatment's going to stay right and positive, for sure.
Yeah.
I remember reading about the things that you mentioned, Schuler. That was a good point.
What's that, Andy?
The things about the people in Central State being bad and mistreating the patients and things like that. I remember reading about that in one of my books.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there's plenty of books that have Central State highlighted, and sadly, it's well known for mistreatment. And a lot of the buildings have been torn down and the history forgotten. And I wish the 148 acres of the location would have been left alone, and they would have turned it into like an indoor and outdoor history museum. Because even though the land and the buildings held a lot of bloodshed and, bad energy, you don't want history to repeat itself. So I think that would be good.
Exactly.
But obviously there's higher ups than I that are like, oh, we can make money off of this and we don't need to worry about a bad reputation. So
yeah.
Well, I hate to say this, but I know we're kind of pressing up for time here, and I wanted to see if Nate had any last words here before we get towards the end of our podcast, sadly.
No, I mean, it was nice talking to you, Sylvia. I just noticed that there's an event on October 22nd on Facebook that I saw at the Mahomet Public Library. Is that where you're?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I am going to be speaking at Mahomet, yeah.
Okay. I just saw that on there, and I was just thinking to myself, that would be cool to come out there.
Yeah.
Are you going to come all the way out there? That's awesome.
I mean, I don't know. Tuesday.
It's a Tuesday.
From 6 to 7.
Okay. May have to look into that. I know I can do a Tuesday.
Yeah.
So, and if we do go out there,
Well, geez, come on up and introduce yourself. Holy cats. And I'll be speaking about the Peoria State Hospital. I'm doing the Fractured Spirits program there.
Oh, that would be wonderful, Sylvia.
It's
Yeah.
only,
Yeah, so you'll hear a couple of the stories again, but that's okay.
only an hour and 50 minutes from here.
So from here in Indiana, it's only
Okay.
an hour and 50 minutes. So we might be able to make that. That's about an average drive for us to find a paranormal haunted location. So.
Oh, fantastic! Oh, wonderful!
Maybe we could say hi.
Well, I would be ever so pleased if you would show up. That would be delightful.
We'll see what goes on. We'll talk to the rest of the team, of course, Kaylee and Ryan, and see what we can schedule up, and we'll keep in touch with you on that. Sylvia.
Yeah, I mean, it's far enough out in advance.
Oh, that would be absolutely splendid.
Yeah, that'd be really cool.
That would be cool.
Yeah.
So Sylvia,
Oh, fantastic.
along with all the amazing stories that you have for us tonight, what are the type of outlets that people listening can reach you on if they want to, buy your books, look a little more into what you've dealt with, your experiences, contact you? Where can they reach you?
Well, the best place to find me is at sylviaschultz.wordpress.com. There you will find links to all of my books on Amazon. You can also get books at any local bookstore. They will happily order them for you. So you can go to Amazon for things like Fractured Spirits and Fractured Souls and The Spirits of Christmas. That is a collection of over 120 true ghost stories about Christmas and Christmas Eve in the dark of winter and December. And it was just ridiculous amounts of fun to write. So I highly recommend that one. On sylviaschultz.wordpress.com, you can also find on the page a link to, that's part of the website, is Lights Out, which is my True Ghost Story podcast. And there are lots of lovely episodes of all kinds of places that I've been and people that I've talked to. And it's people telling me their true ghost stories or me recording my experiences and sharing them with everyone else.
Oh, that's awesome, Sylvia. We're going to have to join you on your podcast sometime if you wouldn't mind having us.
Oh, I would be delighted to.
Awesome. Yeah, I know we have a couple experiences ourselves that we could share.
That would be so great.
Well, Sylvia, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and I hope you look forward to coming back because we would love to do a part 2 with you at the very least.
Absolutely.
That would be completely wonderful. Maybe we could do a Spirits of Christmas program.
That'd be great.
Oh, I'm totally game for that. Absolutely.
Fantastic.
All right, Sylvia. Well, you have a wonderful evening, and we look forward to talking to you next time.
It was an absolute pleasure, Schuler, and delighted to meet everybody, Andy and Nate, and thank you so much for having me on the podcast. It was a joy.
Oh, man, that was awesome, man. I had a blast talking to Sylvia. She was so cool, and she had some amazing stories.
She really did, man. She's down to earth, very easygoing, and her stories, not only were they cool, but they're factual. I mean, we're literally getting these details that are already documented out there that anybody can access to. And it's just fascinating that she has been able to play a personal part in this experience by investigating, knowing people that's been there, and, writing books about this. It's very personable to her. So, I mean, it just kind of felt really legit. It's really nice to have a person on like that. What about you, Nate?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, it was good information that all the stories that she was able to kind of remember just from the amount of time that she wrote her books and all of that history that she's been able to kind of uncover and get to the bottom of an actual truth of a story, and not like we talked about, people will say something and years later it's not the same story.
Telephone.
Yeah,
and with her, it felt like she had a true passion and connection to that location. And for me personally, I could totally relate to her with my passion and connection to Central State Hospital. I mean, that's what really started this paranormal team up for me. And it's gotten me to where I'm at with the people that I'm with now, like you guys. If it wasn't for my intrigued and, really gung-ho emotion with Central State, I don't think I would be here with you guys or with the team where I'm at. So I totally get where she's coming from, and it was really cool to connect with her and kind of get that same feel from someone else that I've never met before.
Yeah.
So, All right. So the same old for all of our awesome listeners out there. We just want to thank you guys for tuning in once again. And if you would like to get on the podcast yourself, contact us, give us some suggestions, got some questions or whatever good stuff you have, to go to Google, type in PILT Paranormal. You'll find our website, Facebook, Instagram, our podcast, and all of our other cool, awesome outlets that we're attached to. And if you'd like to get on as a guest, just send us an email, message us, give us a call, let us know, and we'll get you on because we love to hear your stories and talk the paranormal. So for sure, contact us. So Andy, Nate, you guys have anything else?
No,
that's about it.
Pretty good for the evening. All right. Well, once again, thank you guys for listening to the Para Connection podcast, and we hope to have you join us next time for next time's episode. Until then, stay frosty.